Hi folks, welcome to the third presentation in ARA's webinar presentation series. My name's Paul Doyle and I'm the General Manager Rail Freight and Ports at the ARA. I'm really pleased to introduce our webinar presenter for today, Sue McCarrey, the CEO of the Rail Safety Regulator, or ONRSR as they're more commonly known. Sue's presentation is titled Response to COVID-19. As part of her role with ONRSR, she oversees the nation's standalone rail national law and works with industry, governments and unions to ensure a safe rail system for the community. ARA has had a long relationship with ONRSR and regularly work with them on rail-related safety matters. Having since February this year, my relationship with ONRSR isn't quite as long. I see firsthand the way that they support the rail freight sector during COVID-19, and the feedback from a lot of our members is that ONRSR's leadership and guidance during that period was very greatly appreciated. Sue's presentation today will cover the role of ONRSR, the response to COVID-19, and also more broadly the outlook for rail safety in Australia. I'll just remind everyone of some of the housekeeping rules. So we've allowed some time at the end, questions and answers. You can post your questions throughout the presentation by clicking on the dark blue hand icon in the top right corner of your screen, and Sue will seek to address them at the end of her presentation. PDF slides are also click on the light blue arrow resources icon, you'll be able to access those. And also, if you want to go into full screen mode, you can hover over the top right-hand corner of the slides, and that'll put it into full screen mode, and you just press a little box, or you can press arrows and you'll go back into being able to see the slides and the presenter at the same time. This webinar is live and interactive, so if you experience any technical issues, then please call the Redback support team. But with that, I'll now hand over to Sue and welcome her to today's webinar.
All right. Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks very much for the invitation from the ARA to actually give a presentation today. And I think the presentation weekly and for everybody dealing with COVID-19 as we listen to daily press conferences, both from the Prime Minister and state premiers, giving us a bit of an update as to where we're at. So it's an ever-changing feast, and although we're now talking around flattening of the curve, I think we're also aware that we're not quite sure as to where it might lead next, particularly with what could possibly be particular spikes in particular locations, as we've seen in Victoria with the meat factory and other places, and I think we're probably going to see more of that. So look, I am going to do just a bit of a general overview. I want to talk about some of the operational implications that we've had from COVID-19. And I think we've not perhaps had as many as we thought we could have in the beginning. I think certainly in those early times when we're all kind of going through shutdown and we had panic buying going on, I think we really, a number of companies were doing risk assessments, as were we, on what the impacts might be. Luckily, I think a number of those haven't come about, but others did. So I'll talk through a bit about the additional implications both for us and in word industry. And how that relates to the Rail Safety National Law. And I think also looking back now in hindsight, where we had some flexibility under the law and where we didn't. So I think that's an interesting bit to cover. Just some resources that are on our website that are useful if you haven't had a chance to see them. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the other side of COVID-19 and where we're heading now, both again as an organisation and perhaps with industry. So hopefully, let me just make sure I press the right arrow in the right place. I'm used to pressing the arrow on the laptop. Look, for us, we've obviously changed as an organisation very much, just as everybody else has. Who would have thought 12 months ago that I'd be doing a presentation to what is up to about nearly 150 people from my dining room with my sort of garden in the background? I think it's quite a different way of one we've got used to now, and I'm hearing that term all the time now where people say we're at that new normal. And Paul and I were chatting beforehand saying I think there are going to be a lot of really good lessons that come out of this as well on how we're now used to using this sort of technology and how we may be able to use it a lot more just in the way we work. So we as an organisation, generally all of us are working from home. Our offices are open. So for those involved in investigations and interviews and things, the office is still open, so they're able to access it. We've not actually closed them down. But for most of the staff, we are actually now working from home. We already had a mobile way of working because our staff are out on the system so much. We have a lot already set up on tablets and phones, and most of our officers don't have a desk phone, they actually have mobile. So in some ways moving to that more mobile wasn't too difficult for us. Like always, we've tried to a risk-based approach to what we're doing. So we've sat down as an organisation and said, look, what was going to be routine over the next month or two and can wait? What can we do through just a desktop check and an audit? Or what is high risk during this COVID-19 period, and therefore we need to continue to focus on it. So we've continued to do our job-based approach to look at where we actually need to continue to be active and where we could actually step back for a period of time, which also probably gave a bit of a relief to you as well. We did set up, we were invited to participate in a working group that the Commonwealth have led and done a fantastic job with all the state jurisdictions and held all of the freight industry. So it was rail freight as well as the trucking industry, where we were able to hear firsthand from chief medical officers or border force, police, all of those different agencies which were impacting on rail freight operators around the country. So that has been really useful during COVID-19. And I also brought together a group of key freight operators around the country where we're able to talk to them directly on what was impacting small, medium and large freight operators in particular, and where might we be able to help. And also where we had areas that weren't necessarily kind of our responsibility, like trying to get staff crossing borders, etc. We were, because of contacts at times with government, we were able to help out a bit there. So that's been really useful to us. We've now wound that back a little bit, but with the intention of building it back up if we need to as the days move forward. One of the things we also did as a result of COVID-19, as a result of those workshops or meetings that I talked about, we were putting out regular updates to rail transport operators. So anyone who was an accredited operator was getting a regular contact. So hopefully you saw a bit of that, and we were putting a COVID-19 fact sheet, updating it and putting it on our website so that people could actually access updated information on a regular basis. But we also, by that stage, when COVID sort of first really started to impact, we'd done our budget for next year. For the next financial year. And of course, our budget gets approved by the Ministerial Council, and that's what determines the fees moving forward. We actually pulled that back and did a recast of our budget, and we've actually made sure we've done no increase to ONRSR's budget for next year. That means we've had to make some savings internally because you've always got staff salary increases. Our rental increases around the country can range between 3 to 3.5, 4%. So we've looked at ways we can actually make those savings so that we don't actually put an increase to the budget for the next financial year, which should be a help to industry. Now, before you sit there and think, oh, beauty, our fees will be exactly the same as last year, that's never the case. Just a reminder that that's the total budget. The way in which that is then allocated back out to industry depends on where governments might put some money in to cover fees in some states, they don't in others, and then it's determined by your track and train kilometres. So your fees may still change, but my total budget that's being allocated across hasn't changed from last year. All right, so just looking at from an operational perspective, and I've covered off on a bit of this already. As I said, some non-critical activities have been postponed. We have turned some of the more routine stuff to desktop analysis, which means we haven't had to be out on the system quite as much. We have continued investigations. We think really important where we've got particularly those sort of more detailed investigations into more serious incidents or near misses. They've continued, although some of those interactions have been modified where they have been done on video conference rather than doing it in person. We've tried to take a bit more of a pragmatic approach with things like compliance notices where there were deadlines that companies couldn't meet. So where companies have contacted us and said, look, because of COVID, because of these things, we're just not able to meet this deadline. We've been able to, have a discussion and be a bit more flexible around those. But under the law, there's really been no change. As far as DNA testing, the general reporting done through our portal has all still remained the same. And of course, we are still all responsible for making sure that the people on the system are competent, and that can't change. So during COVID process, a lot of companies have rung us and had conversations about how they might be able to do that. an example is where social distancing, a lot of the time in the retraining or the recertification of competency of drivers, there'll often be 2 or 3 people in the cab at one time, which means you're not meeting your social distancing rules. So companies have contacted us, so they want to change their procedures around having, using CCTV just for the training rather than having 2 or 3 people. There's been a lot of approaches on how we might do different things during the COVID period of time. And in some ways, it's allowed us to remind people, look, you can change the way you do things. It just means you need to go through that risk management process and your own change management procedures. So if you are going to suddenly change from having that third person in the cab watching what a driver is doing in their recertification of competency, and you're going to change that to CCTV, you go through your normal change management process, which usually involves some consultation as well. Now, for something like that, you wouldn't even need to let us know because it doesn't come under the notification of change. But of course, it's something that further down the track, if we were coming in and having a look, would say, well, just show us your change management, your risk management when you change it. Yep, tick, tick, tick. So it's constantly managing risk and managing it to so far as is reasonably practicable. It doesn't mean you can't change the way you're doing things to meet the new environment that you're suddenly operating in. Our rail safety officers will still get out in the field and have still been getting out of the field where they need to. And again, we've ensured that they've got the appropriate PPE. And I think we're all feeling a bit of a sigh of relief that hand sanitizer is a lot easier to purchase now and face masks, but we've made sure we've had kits for our staff. So if they need to get out on the system, they've got the appropriate PPE to do so. And look, our focus areas, particularly around freight operations, just that constant ongoing work around safety management systems, load irregularities, and monitoring the operations across the country. Passenger, we also have our focus areas on safety management systems, of course, track worker safety, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that later, but that constant sort of monitoring work, but also looking at technologies that are actually out there and being used by different leaders. So again, we'll get more about that when we talk about the other side of COVID. But look, one of the key areas that came up particularly early on, one of the high-risk areas that operators raised with us was the ability for rail transport operators to actually get medicals and medicals undertaken according to the health standard. And particular at that stage, there was a real concern that huge number of our doctors and our chief medical officers that companies use were going to be drawn off into dealing with COVID-19, and there was a very real risk of that. Look, this is one area where, unfortunately, the law didn't allow ONRSR or the regulator to actually do an exemption under the law. We could have, but I think it would have meant all, 188 operators having to do their own exemption documentation, which just would have been an administrative nightmare. So we went to Ministerial Council, and it was great that the Transport and Infrastructure Council was meeting weekly, and they actually gave a 3-month exemption for health assessments around periodic medicals in particular. You couldn't ignore if you had a rail safety worker who had a history of medical problems. It was too high risk. If they couldn't get a medical done, you couldn't keep them on the system if you knew there was high risk. But for all those routine, where their past medicals have been fine, they're just due for a routine medical, there was an ability, again, through risk assessment process to say, look, they're low risk. If we can't get them in, and you need to at least attempt to get them booked in, but if the medical staff aren't available, then just, again, through risk management and looking at it, you could say, look, these people are lower risk. They've not had any health issues. They can wait for a few months until we get going. So, unfortunately, again, that had quite a convoluted process where we actually had to get a gazette all done in every single state and territory around Australia to actually implement that. So I certainly thank my team and particularly Julie and her policy team, but also my senior counsel who actually worked with every single state and territory to get those through. They will expire, but they can be extended, so we'll obviously monitor that as time goes on. Unfortunately, during that period, there was a flyer or newsletter put out by the Chief Medical Officers Council, and it's not a criticism. I think they were really trying to help operators to say, look, you don't need to follow the standard or parts of the standard during this time. We did have to put out a very quick notice to say, no, if operators had followed that advice, you would have been contrary to the law. And that's why we made sure in our COVID documentation that we gave you advice on what you could do to be more flexible during this particular time. So certainly kept us busy. Obviously, we continue to communicate through our ONRSR Engage. Hopefully, you've noticed that now we put that out monthly. It's not a quarterly production anymore, and we've tried to increase the useful information and learnings that come out of investigations that we're doing into incidents or near misses or things that will really help the industry. It's something that was asked for in our stakeholder survey, so we've really tried to beef that up over the last 12 months. If you don't get it, please just jump on our website and contact that ONRSR and just say, can I please get on the Engage distribution list? We're happy to include anyone at all that would like to be on that list. So if you're not getting it, please let us know. I mentioned before we produced the COVID-19 fact sheet. That's still on our website. Go and have a look. And as each of the exemptions on those periodic medicals have gone through the different trees, that's been updated and put on. We also do use nowadays our Twitter sphere. Not lots, because we're not somebody who's advertising something, but we have used Twitter as a method of communication much more. And as I said, we're still open for business. So COVID's changed the way we operate, but not changed the fact that we're still out there and doing our job. So interesting, I think we're all now kind of starting to look and say, well, what now? We're all seeing that curve flattened, and depending on the state where our staff are operating, we've got some states that haven't seen positive cases for quite some time. So that is likely to start changing the way we do things. Now, like everybody else, we've got our consultative committee, our work health and safety committees developing a plan now for how we might reintroduce ourselves back into the workforce. We're not going to rush it. I think we've proved that we can operate differently. So we'll do a slow re-entry, I guess, depending on announcements that come out of National Cabinet. I think we've all seen that a potential trigger for this will be the 11th, which is Friday, and we're expecting, like many others, a few announcements to actually come out of that. But like everybody else, we might do it differently across the jurisdictions, because obviously the number of tests and the number of positives out of COVID-19 are different in those different locations. But our operations will remain a priority. They have been all the way through this, and they'll continue to be a priority. But we're following the medical advice like everybody else is at the moment, sort of listening to those chief medical officers around the country. And, you know, for us, social distancing is a new normal. We're re-looking at our offices, like else meeting rooms, how many people we can actually fit, keeping that social distancing up as we move forward. And I think we as an organisation will do things a bit differently. I think we will travel a little less. I think we learnt that we can actually use this technology really well, and that we can still work with people and communicate with people. That doesn't mean you don't have to at times meet face to face. And I'm going to talk about a few things we have had to put on hold because of that. But I do want to revisit our national priorities. So these have changed ever so slightly, as you can see from last year's, but some of them can go on. And I guess it's always hard to level crossings off one of our priorities, because they are always a high risk area for rail operators, and therefore they're a high risk area for us. And we work not just with the operators, but also with governments and road authorities around the country, trying to ensure that we get better level crossing safety, but also around education campaigns and things to remind our road users about making sure they follow the right safety systems. On the first one too, in track worker safety, has been a real push for us over the last 12 months or so, and will continue to be. We're still seeing out there a number of near misses around track worker safety, which could have been a lot more serious. So it is a real focus for us. We're doing a number of investigations into some near miss incidents around the country, and where we can, we'll make sure there's some lessons learned in relation to that. But we are taking track worker safety very seriously. Please look at your procedures, follow those procedures. If they're not working, then go through a process to change them. Don't keep using policies and procedures that just don't work for your people that are out there on the system. And that leads straight after that third one. We find in that track worker safety space in particular, but in many others, there's a lot of contract staff, labour hire staff being used in this space. We've seen out of investigations that we've done where track protection officers will be labour hire or contract staff, and they are just not familiar with then sometimes not familiar even with the geographic location that they're working in, let alone the procedures. And we might think that's really obvious, but we're actually seeing that come out of investigations that we're doing. So please can we make sure the most important person in that signalling room who's moving around the trains, so that track protection officer whose job it is to make sure that the people out there on the system is safe. They need to be incredibly competent. You need to make sure that they know the system and they know your procedures. But also looking at contractor management more generally, because it's not just coming up in the track worker safety space, it's coming up in other areas where we're all busy. There's a lot of construction work going on across Australia. We're relying more and more on contractors. I don't need to remind any of you, you can't contract out of your safety responsibilities under the Rail Safety National Law. So please make sure that the contractors you're using, in whatever form they take, are actually competent to be undertaking the task that they're doing, but also have knowledge of your system and how you operate so that they're doing it in the safest way possible. So control assurance, we've just done this internally ourselves where we've gone through risk management internally, looked at what controls. I mean, we all have as part of our risk management a whole range of controls in place that we say, yep, that's controlling that risk. Are you testing those controls? Are you auditing those controls? How do you know? You've said they're controlling a risk. How do you know that that control is actually effective? So that's something that we're going to be out focusing on over the next 12 months or so. So that gives you a bit of a heads up to have a look at what's actually happening within your own organisation. So look, I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I will do when next year or so, because I think it is a real reminder to the rail industry that every single day we're out there, we are at risk. And the incidents of Jumperkine in WA on Christmas Eve and then Wallen in Victoria more recently, where 3 of our rail safety workers out there on the system lost their lives. So it is a very good reminder to all of us. They are very large and detailed investigations for us. They continue. They have not gone on hold, and we continue to investigate those incidents. And we do investigate them very broadly. We're not just looking at what happened on that night or on that day. We look at a whole range of issues, and obviously part of the role of that is to ensure that we've met our responsibilities under the Rail Safety National Law, and I say we, I'm largely talking about the operators involved, but also to look at what lessons there may be to learn out of those. So they will continue to be a big focus for us over the next 12 months or so. And so continuing on from 2020, I wanted to talk a little bit about the cost recovery review. We've done a huge amount of work in this area. This is not easy. There's a lot of modelling that we need to do to see how a cost recovery model based on risk and regulatory effort may work. It sounds easy, but once you start to unpick it, it's a very difficult model to actually develop. And we've actually got working groups we're working with in industry who are helping us develop parts of that model, and I really appreciate that effort being put in. We're also working with governments and obviously Ministerial Council. When we come out to do a wider consultation across industry, which will go past the reference group we've been working with, it is quite a detailed process. It's not something we can do by video conference. We really do need to be sitting in the room and step you through models being developed and what it looks like and how that modelling actually, what the outcome of that modelling is. So once COVID releases a little bit and we're free to come out and start doing that consultation process, look out for it. We will be running some workshops around the country. Like many, we're waiting for the outcome of the Productivity Commission review, and we actually look forward to that. We look forward to perhaps some suggestions or recommendations that might take us forward. We never believe we've got the perfect system. We actually think the Rail Safety National Law does provide a certain number of flexibilities, but it's also not perfect. So we look forward to seeing the outcome of that particular review and seeing if there are some changes that can be made moving forward. One that you'd be aware of is the National Rail Safety Data Strategy. This isn't an ONRSR project. This is actually a rail industry total type project, and almost with governments as well. So it's been a very long time since we kind of said if we could start again on what safety data should be collected, what would we collect? And it's not just for our use, it's so that there is a central repository of data that will only use what we need to use as the regulator, but governments use rail safety data, as does the outcome model for the ARA needs data for industry use. So does RISB, obviously, for their, particularly for their risk model and other things that they're using it for. So wouldn't it be nice if we could just have a central repository so you're not having to report data 10 times? We can only access what by law we need to access, and others can access what they need. So I think ARA, this is very much being done in partnership with the Australasian Railway Association, and we're obviously working with RISB too, because of information that we feeds into the risk model, which I know a lot of companies use out there. So again, that's something that we were just ready with ARA to go out and start doing some consultation on. And I know a lot of you were a part of that. We've got a number in the industry we've been working with who are going to help with those workshops. Watch this space. Again, as soon as those border things actually get lifted, we'll be able to get out there and start moving and do some workshops of that with the ARA. So please look out for that. It's allowed us to really look at our data, because the history of that was built around, particularly around the heavy rail space. The rail industry's changed a lot. Obviously, we've got heavy rail, we've got tourist and heritage, and we've got a lot more light rail around the country. So that data strategy is also looking at what's a more useful data that gets collected depending on what part of the industry you're in. The National Level Crossing Reporting Portal is a project that we're working on actually on behalf of the National Level Crossing Committee. Now, that's obviously also relates to one of our projects, our major safety priorities in level crossing safety. It's a way of saying, look, we collect so much information and we hold so much information as an organisation. How can we push that information back to people who need it and can use it for safety? Governments regularly come to us and ask us for data to help them in decision making around level crossings. We've got a whole range of information useful to the industry, so we're looking at how might we develop a portal so that we can actually push that information out to those who need it, and obviously based on the access rights that you'd have to that information. And we think that more and more we need to allow information and data that we have to be useful to people in the rail industry and to government, so that they can make better decisions around rail safety and other operational areas. And like everyone, we don't want to stop thinking about how things might change into the future. We are, as an organisation, looking at what's changing in the rail industry. I mentioned the much greater use of light rail around the country. Also looking at the greater use of technology in the rail industry, the greater role that technology and tech developers actually play in the industry. We're constantly looking. And as I said, we're looking forward to the Productivity Commission report that will feed into that to say, look, what's changing or what needs to change? Where should we be going to industry and governments to say this isn't working anymore? We should be looking at a different way of doing things. So we never stop doing that as an organisation. So look, I was going to hand it over now to you, Paul, because I think I've almost got to the end of my presentation, which allows quite a bit of time for questions. And I think you wanted to try and leave a good sort of 25 minutes or half an hour. So I'm happy to throw it to you, Paul, and see if any questions have been coming through.
Yeah, look, we've got a few questions that have come through, but certainly those of you who are dialed in and would like to ask some questions, please send them through and we'll try and get through as many as we can. First question, Sue, is as people start returning to work, operators will be focused on meeting social distancing requirements for staff and customers alike and getting back to new normal. How will ONRSR support accredited operators during this time?
Yeah, look, again, I think I want to go back and remind people that there is flexibility under the law, and there is flexibility around your safety management systems, as long as there is a risk-based approach to it. So again, if you need to change the way you're doing things because of returning to work and having to build in social distancing around what you're doing, if that means you need to change your safety management system, there's no reason why you can't do that. You just need to say, well, what are the risks with that? Is that going to then create other risks that we need to think about, and how might we manage those? If you're unsure, give us a ring, because you have the ability under the law to change your safety management system. If it results in a major change, then you may need to do a notification of change to us, or it may be a variation to your safety management system. But you can change the way you're doing things. You shouldn't be stuck by an old safety management system that's existed for 10 or 15 years. In fact, I'd say that's unsafe to do that. So you will need to sit down and say, well, what's going to change as a result of going back, returning to normal? What's going to change as a result of social distancing? I mentioned, potentially not being able to have 3 people in a cab in order to do that sort of recertification and those types of things. So how might you do that differently? Do you have CCTV in your cabs? Can you be using CCTV? But you need to go through your change management process to do it. But don't be afraid to sit down and say, we need to do things differently. If you're unsure, we encourage you to give our local office, whoever is the main person you deal with at ONRSR, please give them a ring and have a chat to them about it.
Yeah, no, that's good advice, Sue. And I guess the other part of it is, if you've got a safety manager within your organisation that's saying, we must do it this way, it has to be done this way, doesn't hurt to get a second opinion from
Thanks for that, Paul. Because don't get me wrong, we have some fantastic safety managers across the system, but I do occasionally get somebody say to me, I'm told we can't change this because the regulator said, or because the law says. And I say, well, actually, no, it doesn't. The law is not that prescriptive in 95% of cases. So have a look at it. Sometimes it's your own safety management system that has that rigidity built in. As I said, you can change your safety management system as long as you go through that change management to make sure that you don't change it to something that's more high risk. So you've got to sit down and say, well, what are the consequences if we change from doing it this way to this way? But don't let your own safety management system then become, the rigidity that the law is not saying it needs to be.
Yep. No, that's great advice, Sue. Next question here is, does ONRSR have the capability to conduct accreditation remotely?
Talking about a whole brand new accreditation, a certain amount of it, yes. There's a huge amount we can do remotely, and we do now. So if it's a brand new accreditation or it's a major change, so sometimes a big construction project will be not a new accreditation, but it will be a big variation or a change to an operator's system. A lot of that we do remotely through desktop. So obviously we're looking at any new procedures that you've developed, or if it's a brand new accreditation, it's a whole new safety management system. So a lot of that we can do remotely. But there are also times, particularly if it's a major change or it's a whole brand new accreditation, we are going to need to get out, because we need to test that system. We need to get out and say, well, look, you've said in your paperwork that you're doing A, B, C, or you're constructing it to this standard. We need to come out and do a check through a spot inspections or audits to do a check on that. So it's a bit of both, Paul, but yeah, a huge amount of it is done by desktop. It's already done by desktop now, where it's a new accreditation, but probably even more so with COVID. But we do still need to get out and do those checks, and I think there'd be an expectation that we would. Excellent.
Thanks, Sue. Next question we have is one that's a broader sort of question about the sector, but just how well do you think the rail sector is performing in relation to safety? And I guess you touched on a couple of the incidents in your presentation, but interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think we need to, constantly step back. And I think we do have a good safety record in rail in Australia. There's no doubt about that. We have a good system. I think it's a good thing for the community as a whole if we have more freight on rail. That is a good thing. If we have more people using public transport, whether it be on the light rail or heavy rail, that's less people on the road. We know that people are safer on rail than they are, driving in sort of traffic or with more trucks on the road. So, we do have a good rail system in Australia. There's no doubt about that. But, I think it would be remiss of me not to say, look, we do have when we have an incident like Jumpakine in the West, where the train driver lost his life, and we had Wallen where two drivers, a driver and a pilot, lost their life in Victoria, we must step back as an industry and say this is a stark reminder that every day we're out there, rail safety workers can be at risk. So please, and I'm not going to talk about the individual incidents because it wouldn't be appropriate for me to do that at this stage, but it is a good reminder for everybody to not forget your basics. What are the procedures you need to make sure are in place before you're either out there on the track or in driving a train? Are you following your own procedures around rostering and shift changes and breaks? And are you making sure you're following your own procedures around working on track, or if you're working in a degraded mode, whatever it is, can you make sure, please, that you don't forget the basics? Because I think we've been reminded this year, or obviously Jumpakine was towards the end of last year, but it is a reminder to us all to make sure we don't forget the basics around our rail safety.
Excellent. Thanks, Sue. Next question. Do you produce any reports to track areas where there are specific areas of improvement for the sector, i.e. high risk areas where management systems might need to be updated, etc.?
Yep, so we do. We actually do a whole range of different levels, and there's obviously a difference between what sort of work we do or might be reports that are publicly available versus those that we do internally as part of our job to help us be a risk-based regulator. So publicly, we're putting a lot more information out that the general public can access, including operators and government. So we have an annual rail safety report, which is now tracking. That data now goes back to the beginning of ONRSR, so in January 2013, which is allowing us to do some good trend work across some of those key safety areas. So running line derailments, level crossing incidents, wrong side failures at level crossings, and others. So there's a national report we put out at the end of every year, which is made public and goes on our website. So that's actually helping us track some of those higher risk areas right across the industry. We also do many other reports internally. So we will actually do a lot around the freight sector, for example. So we don't just bundle everybody into one. We actually look at what are some of the key issues which are high risk at the moment in the freight sector. What are some of the areas in the passenger sector which are high risk? And we obviously look at the difference between the heavy rail, passenger sector, light rail, but we also look at tourist and heritage. So we don't kind of just shove everybody together and say, oh, these are the areas of highest risk in the industry. We actually break it down to sectors so that when our staff are out there working with the freight industry, they're actually focusing on things that are we see as being high risk and relevant to the freight sector, as we do with passenger heavy rail and passenger light rail, and with tourist and heritage. We have to work differently with each of those sectors. But then we drill it down even further, Paul, where we actually have internally, and please don't ask me for a copy, we actually drill down by operator. So for every 190 operators that are accredited across Australia, we actually have quite a detailed analysis that our staff use to look at what are the key issues we need to focus on for this operator. So that's where they sort of say it's great having a national regulator because we are a lot more consistent. That doesn't mean that we're treating every operator the same, because if we did that, we wouldn't be focusing on things that are high risk and perhaps leaving alone things that are much lower risk. What operating consistently means is that we're interpreting the law consistently. So what our views of so far as is reasonably practicable should be reasonably consistent across the country, as opposed to how the law used to be written and drafted differently. And you had 7 different regulators who would then interpret what they thought the law meant quite differently. But we actually break that down to quite a level where our rail safety staff have an analysis of each individual operator so that we can be focusing on the right areas. I do that if I'm actually going to meet with the CEO of a company. I'll often take, and I will actually often share them a copy of that report where I'll get an analysis from my team using these wonderful data analytics tools that we have available to us now, and with the information we have, not just from category A and B incidents, but also information that's come out of audits or inspections or investigations. So when I go and talk to a company, a CEO or a senior member of the company, I can actually talk specifically about their organisation, the good things that are happening, where they've got some really positive trends, but also where there might be some areas that need greater focus. So I think, that greater use of data analytics is really helping us be a much more risk-based regulator and much more relevant in the work that we actually do out on the system.
Great. Next question, which I think is quite topical at the moment. So interested in your thoughts on this one, Sue. The passenger patronage at the moment, I guess we're seeing some fairly low numbers. We're just starting to see it increase a little bit, but we're still below 10% in a lot of areas. And I guess that'll take some time as restrictions get lifted and we start seeing people back into the workforce. I guess do you see a role there for ONRSR in, I guess, attracting people back to rail and as a public transport means? Because I guess there will be some people that will be concerned about safety of rail and public transport going forward when they're back into work.
A really interesting question, and it's whether or not it's an ONRSR role publicly or not. I think it'll be probably much more those passenger operators themselves, I think, will be out there and through their ministers for transport and their chief medical officers. I think in the first instance, that's where the public have been going to for information. So I think there'll be a lot of important messaging that will come out from them. COVID and the risk of catching COVID on the train is, in a sense, probably is one of those things. Does it come under the Rail Safety National Law, or is that more a health or work health and safety? So it's not the case of, we don't want to kind of also have 4 regulators and 4 different people all getting involved in the same space, which actually just can create confusion. If we need to and we can be helpful in that space, of course we would. But I expect that the lead role would be taken by the big passenger operators themselves, your Sydney Trains, your MTMs, your Queensland Rail, PTA, and of course Adelaide train system here as well. I expect they will be the big, public campaigns will go out from them. And that will be, I would expect, in consultation with their health agencies and chief medical officers and government agencies. So if we can support them, absolutely we'll be there and support them. But I think they would be the organisations better taking the lead, as they have up until now. They're the ones that people are listening to each day with updates and things around the coronavirus.
Yeah, and in fairness, I think ARA has a role to play in that space as well. That's something that I think we've been talking about internally to support the sector going forward. Next question is, next question is, do you believe that investigations may take longer to complete as a result of the COVID-19 provisions, or may you change investigations procedures to keep a similar timing in place?
Certainly if you're talking about the investigations that ONRSR undertakes, particularly those sort of broader compliance investigations, no. We still intend to hit the timelines. As I said, those major investigations have continued. A number of our investigators have continued to go into the office. We have ensured that we can continue interviews under investigation of interviews as part of those investigations have continued. We've been able to do that by video conference, and of course video conferencing now allows you to record interviews that are undertaken. So we've ensured, as we need to under the law and rules of evidence, that we're still able to meet all of those requirements in doing it the way we've done it. So those key compliance investigations have continued, and certainly any operator who's been involved in that will actually know that they've continued. So I don't expect any delay to any of those major compliance investigations as a result of COVID. They can sometimes be delayed for other reasons, but we've ensured that they've continued. It's too important to know what happened in major incidents and very major near misses it's too important that we understand what happened and then we get lessons learned out there to industry. So, no, I don't see any hold up, and we've continued to move ahead.
No, that's good to hear, and I agree entirely. Just related to that, there's one that's come in that I think is a worthy question of exploring. How does ONRSR interact with the Transport and Safety Bureau when there's been an incident? I think that's one that's of interest to a number of people.
Look, it's a really good question, and I think we've learnt, there's a number of organisations that get involved in the investigation space, and particularly with an incident. And if I use, for example, Wallen, where we had the incident occurring in Victoria. The operator was a New South Wales operator. So we've actually got interest from, obviously, there's an investigation that we undertake, ATSB, and I'll come back to that, but also state coroners take an interest in these types of incidents. The state-based police are taking an interest. And we've also got state-based work health and safety organisations, and then because one of the operators was a Commonwealth entity, we've got Comcare. So it's almost like we have parties everywhere. What we try and do is work as closely as we can with those bodies to try and ensure that we don't have 6 different investigations all tripping over each other, because I think that's really important. In particular, we work very closely with state coroners. So we have the ability under the law to provide information to state police and state coroners where we need to try and prevent 2 or 3 investigations all happening at the same time. So we establish that communication very quickly after any major incident, where we're actually working very closely with those organisations. I'll come back to ATSB. We obviously have quite a different role in our investigation. So our investigation is not the sort of investigation where we make the outcome of that report public. Our investigation is for the purposes of understanding if there was any breach of the Rail Safety National Law. That's the first thing that we're looking at. We are also looking at lessons learned for industry, but firstly we're looking at, has there been any breach of the law? We do have the ability under the law to take regulatory action should we see a need to do that, from obviously already the improvement notices or prohibition notices, or right up to potentially prosecutions can come out of those types of incidents. So therefore ours is actually being done for a different purpose. ATSB has a wider educative role, where they need to take an investigation which will have wider learnings for industry, and those reports will be made public so that those learnings can be had. Please be assured we work very closely with ATSB. ATSB have a really good process where before a report is released, they will actually come to us with a draft, so that if part of our investigation we're having things come up which we're not sure have been picked up by ATSB, and vice versa, things that ATSB may have picked up which we haven't been focusing on, we're able to, we can learn from the ATSB report, but also we have the ability to go back to ATSB and say, have you thought about looking at this particular issue? So we do have that good communication between the two of us. Under the law, we have sections under each other's laws that allows us to share information as we need if it's for safety purposes. So we actually do have those arrangements in place, and I have an MOU, but the investigations are done for quite different purposes, which is why you'll see ATSB will go out and say and release their reports publicly and talk about them more in the media. We, on the other hand, have quite a different focus for our investigation.
Excellent. Next question, Sue's related to a comment that you made before about postponing non-critical activities, and there's just a question here in relation to how the auditing might sort of sit in that space. Any comments on that?
Yeah, look, I can't sort of say auditing yes or no. So it depends on what we're going to audit. So when I say we're looking at critical, if we were going in to do an audit on an area that perhaps we had a real concern about and that we think is high risk, then that will still be undertaken. As I said, we may do a fair bit of that auditing by desktop in the first instance and then follow up with a site visit. But it's not so much as, auditing's critical, inspections are not. it depends on what we were actually going in to audit. Was the audit a follow-up to some near misses that's actually caused some concern for us, or was it just a routine audit that was part of the normal process? So again, if it was routine and we can hold off, or we can do a fair bit by desktop, then we have been. Although as restrictions start to lift, of course, we're going into a slightly different way of operating again. But if the audit wasn't routine, if it was actually following up because we were concerned about a particular area, then that would be more high risk, and therefore we'll ensure that continues. So if you're worried about whether or not your audit's going to go ahead, you probably should give us a call and we'll let you know.
Yeah. Look, I mean, and not all audits are audits. It really depends on what it is that you're auditing, I think is a fair point that you make. An interesting question here in relation to just, are you working with universities to support future engineers, or working in the space of sort of improved safety in design, or, building future rail projects and upgrades that sort of mitigate some of these safety risks that might be there?
Yeah. Look, a really good question. Look, not so much in universities, although if we're invited, we'd have to go. But where we do try and work more is, I think gone are the days, and this is where I talked about, regulation has changed so much, or being a regulator has changed so much even in the last 10 years, or certainly the 15 that I've been involved in rail, off and on, or 16, I'm losing track of the years, has really changed in the sense that I think there was sort of a history where the only people we ever dealt with was the accredited operator. That's just not the case anymore. I work, and the team works constantly with governments or authorities or PPPs that are involved in some of that new kind of construction work, or whether it be new technologies around the country. So for us, pretty much in that major project space, as soon as we're aware that there is a new project coming. So 2 to 3 years ago, when we knew that Cross River in Brisbane was being funded, we were sort of making phone calls to say, let's come and we'll have a chat. There'll be, sometimes it's a statutory authority which will be set up by governments to start the planning for a whole new rail line or a whole new technology or signalling system or whatever it might be. We'll get on the front foot and actually call them and say, let's come and have a talk. It's not because they're necessarily an accredited operator at that stage. It just means we can start having conversations early on in the concept planning or design stage, so that we can actually foresee and say, look, you will need to be thinking about these things when you're designing this tunnel, or when your software engineers are looking at this new technology, or whatever it might be. And we actually encourage people involved in the industry, if you're at those really early stages, it's much better for your project and much better for us and safety outcomes if we just have conversations early. So we will sit and talk about what our expectations will be too, which actually helps the project plan for 2 years, 5 years, and sometimes even 10 years down the track. So we really encourage that to happen. If we don't hear from you, we'll tend to get on the phone pretty quickly. We track government announcements by industry on new projects, new technologies, particularly as soon as we know that it's likely to receive funding, we'll be out there having conversations, because it's a really good question around ensuring that safety is built in from the very early design stages. The last thing you want is the regulator turning up just when you're getting ready to sort of get your documentation signed off and cut a ribbon, and we sit there and say, you know what, your whole design didn't take into account a major rail safety issue. It is much better, and it's much better project management to have those conversations early. So a really good question. Yeah,
agree. Another one. So we've probably got about 5 minutes or so. So I think we'll finish with a couple of questions. First one is in relation to the New South Wales and Queensland fatigue management requirements, and just the differences there. And just, do you ever see a world where we will have some level of consistency?
Yeah, look, I think you can never say that things are going to stay the same. I think our laws and regulations do change on a regular basis. I mean, we look at what the law looked like even 2-3 years ago. There are constant reviews happening and things change within the law. If we look back a little bit too, we've sort of, when we look at where we were, for those of us around when the old state-based systems where we had, 6 or 7 different state pieces of legislation. We sometimes forget along that journey about how many differences we got rid of as a part of that process. Now, I wasn't the regulator in the early days, but I was involved at a senior level in WA government, where I actually sat on groups across the country driving that shift in legislation. So we got a lot of consistency out of that process, and it was a lot of hard yakka to actually get there. We do still have, and I know people often talk about the derogations that exist in the state-based laws. And the first draft of the Productivity Commission talked about 80 derogations. So I want to kind of cover that too, because although there are still 80 derogations or something across states, we actually did a big piece of work with the ARA, for those who were working at the ARA at the time, where we actually went out to industry and said, of those 80, which ones kind of make a difference? Which actually impact you as a rail operator? And it actually came back essentially with only 5. Most of the derogations are just little tweaks that happen because it has to relate to a state-based work health and safety law or something. But in practice, it doesn't make any huge difference to your actual rail safety management system. But the 5 that obviously came up, one was about data loggers in certain states. That's actually been resolved through a RISB standard, which is great. So tick, we dealt with that. There were different requirements to train comms in New South Wales. That was particularly out of the Glenbrook rail accident and others. Because modern technology has moved ahead in train comms, it's kind of ceased to be an issue because technology has overtaken it. The mirror law in WA continues to be an issue, and we continue to work with WA government, and WA government, we've had communication that says they are actually trying to resolve that. But of course, what remains is the DNA testing requirements in New South Wales, which we continue to talk with particular policy people about, and also then the fatigue requirements in New South Wales and Queensland. Look, my view, and I've made my view clear that, we are a risk-based regulator. I believe that monitoring of hours of rail safety workers is incredibly important in any fatigue management program, and we have seen that in particular incidents. But it's not necessarily about a specific number of hours, which is why I don't believe we need to have mandated hours in the law. We can do it through a risk-based approach, which is what we do in the other states. Because we often see incidents where fatigue may be an impact, but it will happen 4 hours into a shift, not 9 or 10 or 11. So that's why we need to look at a whole range of issues around fatigue. It is about their hours, so please don't think I'm saying that hours aren't important. They're incredibly important. How many hours, but how many hours off between shifts? How many back-to-back shifts of how many hours has been undertaken? Was the person able to get good rest and sleep between shifts? Because sometimes households don't allow for that. There are so many things that need to be taken into account in fatigue management. It is a really complex area. My view has always been that we can do that through a really good risk-based approach, making sure we actually address all those issues, of which hours is a part of that. I've always said we need to look at all those things. Even in those states where we have those mandated hours, we need to look at things that might contribute to fatigue having an impact 4 hours into a shift or 5 hours into a shift. And sometimes I worry that there's a sense of comfort that comes out of just hitting those hours. And when we've looked at incidents that have occurred where we believe fatigue may have been a contributing factor, it hasn't generally been at the 9-hour mark or the 10-hour mark. It's often been earlier on in the shift. So look, I believe it'll be interesting to see what the Productivity Commission comes out with. But our law is constantly being reviewed. Our law is constantly changing. So there is every possibility that things may change into the future.
Excellent. Well, that's pretty much all we've got time for. Thank you for virtually chatting with me and with everyone.
That's fine.
I think been a fantastic presentation. Lots of insights for me and hopefully for those that dialed in. So just a reminder that this is a weekly series that we have. So next Wednesday we've got Kevin Nuttall talking about getting past COVID-19, really a strategy for how you can survive and thrive. So those that are interested in that should register for that. And also the slides from this particular presentation will also be made available to those that registered. So thank you everyone for participating, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.